You're listening to the Hey Legal podcast.
CPD, when you want, where you want.
CPD for modern lawyers.
This free Hey Legal podcast is brought to you with the support of CaseLoad from Denovo Business Intelligence.
Coming up in this week's episode of the Hey Legal podcast, Mary Ross, a consultant clinical psychologist, is in conversation with Edith, Forrest, advocate of Hey Legal. Mary chats about how she became a clinical psychologist and her current work, including being an expert witness for legal matters.
So my advisor of studies said, I want to be a clinical psychologist, and he couldn't stop laughing. He said, you're not even a psychologist, how would you even know?
Mary also chats about why lawyers stress the deadlines, billing, running a business and the legal mind involved in critical thinking.
People who go into the legal profession are more likely to have a very critical type of thinking that you require. But the problem is if you apply that to yourself, you can become very critical of yourself and very critical of others.
Mary then goes on to discuss how lawyers can train their mind to think in a different way.
Train your mind to think of alternative ways of looking at yourself and at looking at the stressors that are in your life.
We then touch upon competitiveness and its impact upon well-being.
Where it becomes clinical and becomes stress that works against us is when the volume button gets stuck at too high.
And finally, how asking for feedback can help, as lawyers often see this as a sign of weakness, and they shouldn't.
Coming together with our colleagues and supporting each other.
And just being open and
I
not
think so.
pretending that everything's fine all the time, or that we're coping with everything, or that we understand everything.
Precisely, yes.
A jam-packed podcast, so let's begin.
So we're here with Mary Ross, consultant clinical psychologist, just to hear a bit about stresses and how they can affect lawyers in everyday work. So Mary, can you tell us a bit about how you first or decided to become a psychologist? How did that come about?
It came about when I was at school and went on the open day to Glasgow University. And I'd thought of medicine. I knew I wanted to work with people. I wanted to work in a caring role. And we were shown around the psychology department and shown experiments, and psychologists spoke to us. And immediately I could just feel my heart racing. I knew this excites me. It set my heart on fire. And from that moment, I knew I wanted to do psychology. Went home and read up about it. And I think literally the first week, so my advisor of studies said, I want to be a clinical psychologist, and he couldn't stop laughing. He said, you're not even a psychologist, how would you even know? And I was able to explain to him that I loved working with people. I particularly wanted to be part of a journey where people were maybe struggling with difficulties of anxiety and depression. And that's how the journey began.
Wow. And then I know you through instructing you in the criminal court. So how did you then move into dealing with cases in the criminal courts?
Do you know, it was not something I ever pursued. I had never considered the idea of working in that capacity. But you're out there, you're doing work a lawyer would approach and ask, could they instruct? First view is, I don't know how to do this. Second view is, it's a challenge, you can learn. Ask for feedback. If it's not any good, you can work on it. And again, it was a new aspect of my work, and I realised all you're doing is just doing your clinical work and answering the questions that you're asked. And I started to enjoy that kind of work, and I've come into all the doing, criminal work, personal injury, looking at immigration, and loving that aspect of my work too.
Wow. Still clinical based though?
Very much clinical based. Half my time is spent in clinics at the coalface, working with people who've got genuine problems of anxiety, depression, bereavement, PTSD, which are very, very interesting and privileged work. And then the other half is about working with lawyers from various backgrounds.
Right. And you'll know, but recent studies show that around 63% of lawyers feel stress on a daily basis. And I imagine that's something you're seeing in your clinical practice.
Well, I mean, I don't see a lot. I do see people from the legal profession, but I've actually had never stopped to consider, are they overrepresented in terms of levels of stress, anxiety or depression, until you had said that to me and went and looked at the research. And you're absolutely right that the legal profession appear to consistently appear very high up when it looks at psychological studies of stress in relation to professions.
Why might that be? Why would lawyers...
I think, first of all, it is in many aspects of the legal profession that there are stresses associated with the type of work There seem to be deadlines. People seem to have to account for every hour they're spending. There may be financial concerns that you don't have if you're working in the NHS or other organised companies. Also, a lot of the research is saying that the legal mind has something to contribute to the experience of stress. They're saying that people who go into the legal profession are more likely to have a very critical type of thinking that you require for the legal profession. But the problem is, if you apply that to yourself, you can become very critical of yourself and very critical of others. You may have, there seems to be an awful lot of perfectionism associated with the legal profession. So again, it comes about if you've got very high standards of yourself or unrealistic expectations of others, that can contribute. So that there is a kind of emerging research which is saying the problem often comes just as much from within as it does from out with in terms of the type of job.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. And I suppose you're right. When, thinking as a lawyer, you are looking to find an alternative or a different way to look at something. And it can be quite highly critical when you're trying to maybe, particularly for court lawyers, undermine a witness. Then you're looking at it from a different view and perhaps looking at it unrealistically high because you want to undermine someone that might otherwise appear credible, reliable. So
it's kind of like you develop a route all the time for this critical bit, which is very, very important. But also what we would say as psychologists, that you are best placed of all the professions when it comes to challenging any critical thoughts or negative thoughts you have about yourself, because you are very used to doing that critical thinking, to asking what we would call Socratic type questions to get you to train your mind to think of alternative ways of looking at yourself and at looking at the stressors that are in your life. So it's good in the sense that you do have those skills to change it, but not so good that you almost have a predisposition to the onset of stress.
Absolutely.
Keep the conversation going by following our guest on Twitter or by connecting on LinkedIn.
This free Hey Legal podcast is brought to you with the support of CaseLoad from Denovo Business Intelligence. Denovo have successfully provided hundreds of law firms with smart business software solutions. You can find and connect with the Denovo team on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook.
You are listening to the Hey Legal podcast, CPD for modern lawyers.
Another thing I suppose I think you touched on was just the competitiveness amongst lawyers as well.
Yes.
And it usually, no matter what area of law you're in, whether it be litigation or even representing someone where you're having to correspond by email, letter with another solicitor, it's in a way, it's always a battle, isn't it?
Yes. And I think, again, how real is that battle? You would be best placed to answer that more than I am. But every one of us, and I think more and more we're talking about this now, the members of the royal family, Kate and Wills, are now saying we need to talk about our mental well-being. We need to all admit that there are days when we wonder about ourselves and our capacities. We wonder whether other people are judging us. And that's actually normal. We all worry about those things. Where it becomes clinical and becomes stress that works against us is when the volume button gets stuck at too high. So sometimes, when we find ourselves in a situation, we're sending emails and we're wondering, how is this being perceived? How am I being perceived? We have to work out, is that in my head? Is that my self-critical self? Is that my being over-perfectionistic? And are we buying into something that no one wants to buy into anymore? Can we just all admit, I'm a bit intimidated by you? Am I doing a good enough job? Sometimes I get that when I work with lawyers. You may be involved in several cases, and particularly recently I was involved in a case. It was an immigration, a first-tier tribunal to go, and I came out thinking, did I do well? I don't know if I did do well. No one said anything to the end, and we'd all left together. And I thought, I could go to my own self-critical things, but I think what I'll do here is I'll challenge it. I think I might know after 38 years if I was doing something terribly wrong. That wasn't working. I thought, I have to email the lawyer. Right. And I emailed and said, I always want feedback. Never be afraid to give me critical feedback that I can learn from, but I need to know. And he said, I don't know what you're talking about. The reason I instruct you is 100% success. with the cases. And I'm like, you've never told me that.
Wow.
So I think one of the things we have to learn to do is to be honest enough and humble enough to say, I'm a bit worried here. I'm not feeling good about me. And even if that means we open ourselves up to critical feedback, it won't be given in a negative manner. But we need to ask people, how are we doing?
Yeah.
We sometimes need to say, people, do you think I'm doing all right? Do you think I'm off beam? Could I do better? And we don't do that as a society. We think that that's a sign of weakness. And that was the other thing that comes out in the research with the legal profession, is they see it as it's too touchy-feely, it's a sign of weakness. Whereas I suppose from my background, we're from the profession that says we should be doing this a lot with each other. We should certainly be doing it in society.
Yeah. So it's really, and I can see that there are, not that it's combat in courts or even in lawyers' offices, but there certainly is what people or what lawyers might describe as professionalism. But that's perhaps the thing that's affecting us, and where we can't say, look, I'm actually feeling quite nervous here, or I'm unsure of myself. To say that, some lawyers might think they are undermining themselves or showing themselves not to be competent or professional. But that, you're saying, is the thing that can be damaging us long term.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a kind of balance, isn't there? I mean, we don't want to go around saying, I'm too terrified to go in there, even if we feel it. That's not going to help us. It's not going to help those instructors or who we're working with. But it is about, I think there are people we can confide in. It may not be with another professional. There may be friends, people we're close to, that we can actually say, do you ever get nervous when you're doing... Yeah. I mean, I work in a GP practice. I'm always in early. There's always a knock on the door, a GP saying, do you think it's normal to get anxious about X, Y, or Z? I think that's healthy. Yeah. I don't think any less of the GP for coming in and asking me that. In fact, I think it's a good thing. Yeah. They're more likely to be much more helpful with their patients. But it is about being realistic and about having the communication skills that say, this is an excessive demand, or this particular job that I'm being asked to do is more stressful than another job. It's about naming it with people we can trust.
Yeah, absolutely. It's quite interesting. We had, at faculty, we had training sessions which involved us as individual advocates cross-examining and doing part of a jury speech in front of our peers, which is not, unless you're in a case with, co-accused, then it's something that you rarely do, and you rarely get to see your peers. It's usually the prosecutor or if you're on the other side of the table. But that was really interesting. I think there's probably quite a lot of comfort to be had from seeing other people, because you do get overinflated ideas that, so-and-so is doing great, they're not fazed by anything. But actually, when you scratch the surface a little, we're all very much the same, aren't we? Yeah,
I mean, as a psychologist, one of the reasons we have to go to conferences for our CPD, but one of the lovely things about going to a conference is when you hear, that maybe there's a presentation on new ways of treating anxiety, and I always come away thinking, oh my God, thank God I'm not a fraud, I'm doing a good job. It's not so far removed from what we're being taught. And then the collegiality of meeting with other psychologists saying, we're all doing an okay job. But how often do we stop to say that with our colleagues? So you're right. One of the things that can help as a de-stressor is coming together with our colleagues and supporting each other.
And just being open and not pretending that everything's fine all the time, or that we're coping with everything, or that we understand everything.
Precisely, yes.
Well, that is really interesting to hear, and I suppose it's just, in a way, stating the obvious, that we should just be open.
Do you know, people always accuse psychologists of stating the obvious, and I would not defend that. I think that's absolutely right. It's got to be backed up with technique. Yeah. And I think for all of us, myself included, I mean, when you look at lawyers and what they say can be stressful, too many demands, not enough time, people placing unrealistic demands. So the way we all describe stress in our lives is very often outside. And it's usually about, I don't have enough time, I need to stay up all night, or I'll need to stay in all weekend. There is a flaw in that, in not looking within, because even if stress is outside, sometimes there's very little we can do to change those demands. Certainly, if you're in a job where a boss, a manager is being unrealistic and, not being helpful, not being supportive, you may need to look, do I need to change this? And maybe sometimes we can't change personalities. Do I need to move somewhere else. But other than that, we need to learn to look within, because very often we bring to that experience of stress our own difficulties. Like I said a minute ago about the critical type of thinking, the negative thinking we have about ourselves. So we need to develop healthy habits that maintain good mental health, good psychological functioning.
Mary, thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Absolutely wonderful. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this Hey Legal podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. To hear the full CPD qualifying content, please visit heylegal.co.uk to subscribe and join our community. Or you could ask your law firm to contact us for a firm-wide subscription. Learn more, be more with Hey Legal.